He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, staring down at the city lights below. From this height, everything looked small, manageable, controllable. That was how he preferred his life to be. Every decision calculated, every relationship transactional, every emotion kept at a safe distance. His name was Alexander Harrington, and at 35, he had built an empire that most people could only dream of. Tech companies, real estate ventures, investments that turned millions into billions. He had it all, or so everyone believed. The truth was different. Behind the expensive suits and the confident smile he wore at board meetings, there was nothing but silence. His penthouse was enormous, filled with art worth millions, furniture designed by the most sought-after names in the world, yet it felt like a tomb. He ate alone, slept alone, and woke up each morning wondering why success tasted so bitter. The echo of his footsteps on the marble floors was often the only sound that accompanied him through the vast space. He would stand in rooms that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime and feel absolutely nothing. The emptiness had become so familiar that he had stopped recognizing it as emptiness. It was just existence. Alexander had not always been this way. There had been a time, long ago, when he believed in connection, in trust, in the possibility of something beyond the accumulation of wealth. But life had taught him harsh lessons. His parents had died when he was young, their car sliding off an icy road one winter night, leaving him suddenly alone in a world that felt too big and too cold. He had been only 8 years old, still believing that good things lasted forever, that love was permanent, that family was an unbreakable bond. Their deaths shattered all of those beliefs in a single moment. He was placed in the care of relatives who saw him only as a burden and an opportunity. His aunt and uncle had taken him in, but not out of love. They wanted control of the substantial inheritance his parents had left behind. They had controlled his finances, manipulated his trust, and taught him through their actions that people could not be relied upon. They spent his money on themselves while he wore hand-me-down clothes and ate meals that were barely adequate. The emptiness had become so familiar that he had stopped recognizing it as emptiness. It was just existence. Alexander had not always been this way. There had been a time long ago when he believed in connection, in trust, in the possibility of something beyond the accumulation of wealth. But life had taught him harsh lessons. His parents had died when he was young, their car sliding off an icy road one winter night, leaving him suddenly alone in a world that felt too big and too cold. He had been only 8 years old, still believing that good things lasted forever, that love was permanent, that family was an unbreakable bond. Their deaths shattered all of those beliefs in a single moment. He was placed in the care of relatives who saw him only as a burden and an opportunity. His aunt and uncle had taken him in, but not out of love. They wanted control of the substantial inheritance his parents had left behind. They had controlled his finances, manipulated his trust, and taught him through their actions that people could not be relied upon. They spent his money on themselves while he wore hand-me-down clothes and ate meals that were barely adequate.
They told him he should be grateful, that he was lucky they had taken him in at all, that without them, he would have had nothing. By the time he turned 18 and gained control of his finances, he had learned to view the world through a lens of suspicion and strategy. He had learned that trust was a weakness, that vulnerability invited pain, that the only person he could rely on was himself. He cut ties with his aunt and uncle immediately, changing his phone number and moving across the country without leaving a forwarding address. He never spoke to them again, and he never looked back. He built his first company at 22, a tech startup that revolutionized data security. He had a vision that others could not see, an understanding of technology and human behavior that allowed him to create something genuinely innovative. He worked 18-hour days, sleeping in his office, eating meals at his desk, pouring every ounce of energy into building something that could not be taken away from him. Within 5 years, he had sold the company for a fortune and used that money to build something bigger. Then, bigger still. Each success reinforced his belief that he was better off alone, that relying on himself was the only way to guarantee survival. Romantic relationships came and went, each one ending when the woman realized he would never truly let her in. They would start with excitement, drawn to his success and the lifestyle he could provide, but eventually they would all say the same thing: "You are not really here. You are like a ghost. I feel more alone with you than I did when I was actually alone." He would nod, understanding their frustration, but unable to change. He had built walls so high and so thick that he no longer knew how to tear them down, even when he wanted to. Business partnerships were carefully structured, with contracts that protected him from betrayal. Every agreement was reviewed by teams of lawyers, every clause examined for potential vulnerabilities. He trusted nothing to chance and nothing to goodwill. Friendships were non-existent. He had colleagues who respected his business acumen. He had employees who feared disappointing him. He had acquaintances who appeared at the same social events. But he had no one who truly knew him, no one who could call him in the middle of the night, no one who understood the man behind the empire. The problem had started small. A business partner named Richard Chen made a comment at a dinner about his lack of stability, questioning whether a man who lived alone could truly be trusted with long-term commitments. They had been negotiating a major deal, a partnership that would expand both of their companies into new markets. Richard had 3 children and a wife he spoke about constantly, showing photos on his phone, telling stories about family vacations and school plays. He looked at Alexander over his wine glass and said, "You know, Alexander, in my culture, we believe that a man who does not value family cannot be trusted to value anything else. How can I trust you to honor a 10-year commitment when you cannot even commit to another person?" The comment stung more than Alexander wanted to admit. He had laughed it off, made a joke about being married to his work, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Then another investor, a woman named Patricia Morrison, mentioned it during negotiations. She was considering investing $50 million into one of his ventures, but she hesitated. "You have an impressive track record," she said, reviewing documents in her office, "but there is something that concerns me. You have no roots, no family, nothing that grounds you. What happens if you decide one day that you are bored? What happens if you walk away from everything? I need to know that you have reasons to stay, to build something lasting." Alexander realized that his bachelor lifestyle was becoming a liability. In the world of high-stakes business, perception mattered as much as reality, and he was being perceived as cold, detached, potentially unstable. People wanted to see a family man, someone grounded, someone who understood values beyond profit margins. They wanted to believe he had something to lose, something that would keep him honest and committed. His isolation, which he had always seen as a strength, was being interpreted as a warning sign. That was when the idea came to him. If marriage was what they wanted to see, then marriage was what he would give them. Not a real one, of course. Real marriages were messy, unpredictable, full of emotions he had no intention of dealing with. Real marriages required vulnerability and trust, and all the things he had spent years learning to avoid. No, what he needed was a business arrangement, a contract, someone who would play the part, follow the rules, and disappear when the year was over. It was perfect in its simplicity. He would get the image he needed, the appearance of stability and commitment, and someone desperate enough would get financial security. Everyone would benefit, and no one would get hurt. He tasked his assistant, a sharp woman named Margaret, who had worked for him for 10 years and knew better than to question his decisions, with finding candidates.
Margaret was in her 50s, efficient and discreet, with the kind of competence that made her invaluable. She raised an eyebrow when he first explained what he wanted, but she did not argue. She simply asked for specifications and got to work. The criteria were specific. Women who were desperate enough to agree to the arrangement, smart enough to play the role convincingly, attractive enough to be believable as his wife, and disconnected enough from his social circles to avoid complications. They needed to have no family or connections in his world, no history that could intersect with his business, no ambitions that would lead them to exploit the situation. Margaret compiled profiles, conducted discreet interviews, and vetted backgrounds with the thoroughness of a federal investigator. The search took weeks. Most candidates were unsuitable. Some wanted fame, hoping to leverage the arrangement into celebrity status or social media followers. They talked about the photos they would post, the attention they would get, the doors that would open for them. Others had hidden agendas, planning to sell their stories to tabloids or write tell-all books after the year was over. Margaret uncovered these plans through careful questioning and background checks. A few simply lacked the presence needed to convince his world that the relationship was real. They were too nervous, too obviously acting, too uncomfortable in the high society settings they would need to navigate. Then they found her. Emma Clark, 28 years old, working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over her head. She lived in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, the kind of neighborhood where dreams went to die, and survival was the only goal that mattered. Margaret had found her through a contact at a staffing agency, someone who knew someone who had mentioned a woman in desperate circumstances. The initial screening revealed a story that was both heartbreaking and perfect for Alexander's needs. Emma's mother was sick, drowning in medical bills that no insurance would cover, fighting a battle against stage 3 breast cancer that was slowly draining what little resources they had left. The cancer had been caught late, after Emma's mother had put off seeing a doctor for months because she could not afford the copay. By the time she finally went in, complaining of pain that had become unbearable, it had already spread. Treatment was expensive and brutal, involving surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. The insurance company fought every claim, denied coverage for medications, and refused to pay for the most effective treatments, claiming they were experimental or unnecessary. Emma spent her days as a waitress at a diner called Rosie's, a rundown establishment that served greasy food to truck drivers and shift workers. She smiled through exhaustion as customers complained about cold coffee and slow service, as men twice her age made inappropriate comments and left tiny tips. Her feet ached constantly from standing on the worn linoleum floors, and her back hurt from carrying heavy trays. She made barely above minimum wage, relying on tips that were unpredictable at best. Her nights were spent cleaning office buildings, scrubbing floors, and emptying trash cans in towers much like the one Alexander lived. She was part of a crew that moved through the buildings after everyone else had gone home, working from 10 at night until 6 in the morning. She scrubbed toilets, vacuumed carpets, wiped down desks, and polished glass, always invisible to the people who worked there during the day. Sometimes she would find family photos on desks, images of smiling people on vacations, and she would feel a pang of something she could not quite name. Not jealousy exactly, but a deep sadness for the life she had once imagined for herself. She barely slept, catching a few hours between jobs, napping on the bus that took her from one workplace to another. She barely ate, living on whatever leftover food she could take from the diner and cheap ramen noodles that cost less than $1. She barely lived. Her existence had been reduced to a cycle of work, worry, and weariness. Every day was about making it to the next day, about keeping her head above water, about not drowning in the tide of bills and responsibilities that never stopped coming. She had once had dreams. She had wanted to study art, to create, to see the world beyond the gray walls of her neighborhood. In high school, her art teacher had told her she had real talent, a unique vision that could take her places. She had won awards at local competitions. Her paintings displayed in the school hallways where other students would stop and stare. She had imagined going to college, studying with real artists, learning techniques that would allow her to express everything she felt inside. She had sketched constantly, filling notebooks with drawings of the world as she wished it could be, full of color and beauty and hope. But those dreams had faded under the weight of reality. When her mother got sick, Emma had been in her second year of community college, studying art and working part-time at a coffee shop. The diagnosis changed everything overnight. Suddenly, there were appointments to drive to, medications to pick up, bills that multiplied faster than she could count them. She dropped out of school to take on more work, telling herself it was temporary, that she would go back when things stabilized. But things never stabilized. They only got worse. She dropped classes one by one until there were none left. She took on a second job, then worked as many hours as both jobs would give her. Her sketchbooks gathered dust in a closet. Her paints dried out in their tubes. Her dreams became something she thought about late at night when she could not sleep. A fantasy world that felt further away than the moon. Her own life became an afterthought, something to be endured rather than lived. When the offer came, delivered by Margaret in a crisp suit who looked completely out of place in Emma's neighborhood, she thought it was a scam. Margaret had shown up at the diner during Emma's shift, sitting in a corner booth and nursing a cup of coffee until Emma's break. She introduced herself professionally, handed Emma a business card, and asked if they could speak privately about a potential opportunity. Emma was suspicious immediately. Nothing good ever came from opportunities presented by women in $1,000 suits. But Margaret was patient, professional, and persistent. She explained the arrangement clearly, without euphemism or sugarcoating. A wealthy businessman needed a wife for appearances. It would be a contractual arrangement for 1 year. Emma would live in his home, attend events by his side, and maintain the illusion of a happy marriage. In return, she would be compensated generously. Margaret named a figure that made Emma's hands shake. $1 million. Emma laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "Right," she said. "And what is the catch? What do I really have to do?" Margaret met her eyes steadily. "Exactly what I said. This is not about sex or anything inappropriate. My employer needs the appearance of stability. You need financial security. It is a business transaction, nothing more." She slid a folder across the table. "Read the contract. Have a lawyer review it if you wish. You will see that everything is legitimate." Emma took the folder home that night, her hands trembling as she carried it on the bus. She sat at her tiny kitchen table under a flickering light, reading page after page of legal language. It was thick, filled with terms she barely understood, but the key points were clear. No real intimacy required, no public scandals permitted, no emotional attachment expected, just a role to play, like an actress on a stage. She would be compensated monthly, with the bulk of the payment delivered at the end of the year, contingent on her fulfilling all terms of the agreement. There were clauses about confidentiality, requiring her to never speak about the arrangement to anyone. There were clauses about behavior in public, specifying that she must appear affectionate and devoted at all social functions. There were clauses about living arrangements, making clear that she would have her own private space within his home. There were clauses about termination, outlining the circumstances under which the contract could be ended early and what that would mean for compensation. It was cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of anything resembling human warmth. She read it 3 times, then a 4th, looking for hidden traps or unspoken expectations. But it seemed straightforward. 1 year of her life in exchange for enough money to change everything. She thought about her mother, lying in a hospital bed 3 floors up in a building across town, her face growing paler every day, her body growing weaker despite her fierce determination to keep fighting. The last time Emma had visited, her mother had held her hand and whispered, "I am sorry. I am so sorry you have to do this. I am sorry I am such a burden." Emma had cried then, telling her mother she was not a burden, that she would do anything to help her get better. And now, here was anything, presented in a legal document that promised salvation at a price she was not sure she understood. She thought about the bills stacked on her kitchen table, each one a reminder of how far behind she was, how impossible it was to catch up. Medical bills, rent that was 2 months overdue, utilities that were about to be shut off, credit card debt that had accumulated from trying to cover the gaps between what she earned and what she needed. She thought about the eviction notice taped to her door, giving her 30 days to come up with money she did not have, or face being thrown out on the street. She thought about the exhaustion that had become her constant companion, the bone-deep weariness that made even simple tasks feel insurmountable. She thought about her mother's face, the hope that still flickered in her eyes despite everything, the fight that she was slowly losing. What choice did she really have? This was not about wanting luxury or comfort. This was not about greed or ambition. This was about survival. This was about giving her mother a fighting chance. This was about not drowning. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly, and signed her name at the bottom of the contract. The ink seemed to seal her fate, locking her into a year of pretending to be someone she was not, living a life that was not hers, playing a role in a drama she had never auditioned for. But if it meant her mother would live, if it meant she could stop the constant panic that accompanied every bill, every phone call from debt collectors, every notice threatening legal action, then it was worth it. The first time she walked into his penthouse, she felt like she had stepped into a different universe. Everything gleamed. The marble floors reflected the chandeliers above, catching light and throwing it back in dazzling patterns that seemed to dance across the surfaces. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, each piece carefully selected for both form and function, beautiful and untouchable. There was a sculpture in the entrance that she later learned was worth more than she would earn in 10 lifetimes. A twisted piece of metal that somehow conveyed motion and emotion. The view from the windows stretched endlessly over the city, a panorama of lights and life that seemed a million miles away from the world she knew. She could see the entire downtown skyline, the river cutting through the city like a silver ribbon, the parks and neighborhoods spreading out in all directions. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Emma stood in the entrance, her small suitcase feeling pathetic in her hand, suddenly aware of how out of place she was. Her clothes were worn, her shoes scuffed, and she probably smelled like the cleaning chemicals she had used just hours before. Alexander was waiting for her, dressed casually in a way that still screamed wealth. His jeans probably cost more than her monthly rent, dark and perfectly fitted, and his simple black shirt was clearly designer, the kind of understated luxury that only people with money would recognize. He barely looked at her as he handed her a folder, his expression neutral, professional, as if she were a new employee rather than the woman who would be pretending to be his wife. His handshake was brief, his hand cool and dry, his grip firm but not warm. Inside the folder were schedules, instructions, and a list of expectations. She was to attend business dinners every week, sometimes more if important negotiations were happening. She would accompany him to charity galas twice a month, events where wealthy people congratulated themselves for donating small fractions of their fortunes to causes they would never personally experience. There would be occasional weekend trips to maintain appearances, visits to his vacation home or business conferences where wives were expected to attend. She would have her own room, her own space, but when they were in public, she was to act like a devoted wife, smile, laugh at his jokes, hold his hand, look at him like he was the center of her world, touch his arm when he spoke, gaze at him with affection, create the illusion of intimacy that would convince everyone watching that their marriage was real. It sounded simple enough on paper. He showed her to her room,
walking through hallways that seemed to stretch forever, past rooms whose purposes she could not even guess. The penthouse was enormous, taking up the entire top floor of the building, with spaces that flowed into each other in ways that seemed designed to impress rather than comfort. Her room was bigger than her entire apartment had been. It had a king-sized bed with linens that looked impossibly soft, cream-colored, with a thread count she did not know existed.
There was a sitting area with a couch and chairs arranged around a fireplace that she later learned was remote-controlled, a bathroom with a tub big enough to swim in, all marble and gleaming fixtures, with towels so thick and soft they felt like clouds. The walk-in closet was already filled with clothes in her size, hanging in neat rows organized by color and type. Margaret had clearly been thorough, taking the measurements from their initial meeting and selecting an entire wardrobe. There were dresses for formal events, elegant gowns in jewel tones that shimmered when they moved, casual wear for everyday life, designer jeans and soft sweaters that probably cost more than her car, shoes for every occasion, heels and flats and boots, all in boxes stacked neatly on shelves. Emma touched the fabric of a dress, feeling the quality, the weight of silk and satin, wondering what it would be like to wear something so expensive, to move through the world draped in luxury. "Your schedule is on the desk," Alexander said from the doorway, not entering her room, maintaining a careful distance. "We have our first event tomorrow night, a business dinner with potential investors from Singapore. Margaret will come by in the afternoon to help you prepare and go over details of our supposed relationship. If you need anything, use the intercom system. My office is on the lower level of the penthouse, and I prefer not to be disturbed unless absolutely necessary." With that, he left, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving Emma alone in the enormous room. She sat on the bed, sinking into softness she had never experienced, and wondered what she had gotten herself into. The room was beautiful, luxurious beyond anything she had imagined, but it felt cold, impersonal, like a high-end hotel rather than a home. There were no personal touches, no photos or books or anything that suggested a human being actually lived here. It was perfect and empty, just like the man who owned it. The first few weeks were awkward beyond description. Emma felt like an imposter, walking through rooms that cost more than her entire life, wearing dresses that had price tags she was afraid to look at. She wandered the penthouse during the day while Alexander was at work, exploring spaces that seemed to go on forever. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books that looked like they had never been read, their spines uncracked, their pages pristine. Classics and contemporary works, business books and fiction, arranged alphabetically and gathering dust. There was a gym with equipment that gleamed from lack of use. Top-of-the-line machines that probably cost tens of thousands of dollars, sitting silent and untouched. A screening room with plush seats arranged in rows, a screen bigger than any she had seen, and a collection of movies still in their original packaging. A music room with a grand piano that sat closed, its surface so polished she could see her reflection. Everything was perfect, pristine, and utterly empty of life. It was like living in a showroom, a display of wealth that no one actually used or enjoyed. Alexander barely spoke to her unless they were in public. At home, he disappeared into his office or his bedroom, working late into the night, leaving her to exist in parallel to him rather than with him. She would hear him sometimes, his voice on phone calls that lasted hours, discussing deals and negotiations in a language of business that she barely understood. She tried to make conversation once or twice, attempting to bridge the vast silence between them. She asked about his day over breakfast one morning, trying to sound casual and friendly. "It was fine," he replied without looking up from his tablet. She commented on the weather, mentioning that it was a beautiful day outside. "Yes," he said, still not meeting her eyes. She asked if he had any hobbies, if there was anything he did for fun. He looked at her then, his expression unreadable. "I work," he said flatly, as if that explained everything. Then he returned to his tablet, and the conversation was over. His responses made it clear he had no interest in getting to know her, no curiosity about who she was beyond her ability to fulfill the contract. This was business, nothing more. She was a tool he had hired to solve a problem, no different from the lawyers who reviewed his contracts or the accountants who managed his finances. She felt the weight of that realization settling over her, the understanding that for the next year, she would be living with someone who saw her as an object rather than a person. Their first public appearance was at a business dinner at one of the city's most expensive restaurants, the kind of place that required reservations months in advance and had a dress code stricter than most weddings. Emma wore a black dress that hugged her figure in a way that made her self-conscious, the fabric clinging to curves she usually hid under baggy work clothes. It was elegant and understated, with a neckline that was modest but sophisticated. Margaret had done her hair and makeup that afternoon, transforming her into someone she barely recognized in the mirror. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup flawless, her lips painted a subtle shade that somehow made her entire face look different. Alexander introduced her to a table full of men in suits who smiled too much and asked too many questions. "This is my wife, Emma," he said, his hand on the small of her back, the touch performative but convincing. They had practiced this, Margaret drilling her on their cover story, on the details that would make their relationship believable. She played her part perfectly. She laughed when expected, a light musical sound that she had practiced, touching his arm gently as if the contact was natural and frequent. She spoke about their fictional love story with enough detail to make it believable, weaving together the narrative they had constructed. They had met at a charity event 18 months ago, she told them, her voice warm with false nostalgia. "I was volunteering, helping to coordinate the silent auction, and Alexander bid on a painting I had particularly admired. He won it and then gave it to me. I thought it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done." The men at the table smiled, clearly charmed. Alexander had been persistent, she continued, asking her out multiple times before she finally agreed. "He was so different from what I expected," she said, looking at him with practiced affection. "Everyone sees the successful businessman, but I got to know the man beneath that, someone thoughtful and generous and surprisingly funny." Alexander played his role too, adding small details that made the story richer. "She made me work for it," he said with a slight smile that almost looked genuine. "She turned me down 3 times before agreeing to dinner. I had to send flowers every day for a week." The table laughed, and Emma touched his hand, their fingers intertwining briefly. It was all performance, carefully choreographed, but it looked real. The men commented on how lucky Alexander was, how wonderful it was to see him settled, how she brought a warmth to him that they had never seen before. On the drive home in his sleek black car, he finally spoke to her beyond the usual formalities. "You did well tonight," he said, his eyes on the road ahead, his hands steady on the steering wheel. The city lights streamed past them, reflecting off the polished hood. Emma looked at him, surprised by the compliment. She had been terrified of making a mistake, of saying something wrong, of revealing through some small gesture or inconsistency that their entire relationship was a carefully constructed lie. "Thank you," she replied, unsure what else to say, her hands folded in her lap. He nodded, and that was the end of the conversation. But it was a start. A small acknowledgement that she had value in this arrangement beyond just showing up. She had proven she could do what he needed, that she could play the role convincingly enough to fool people who were trained to spot weakness and deception. It was a tiny crack in the wall between them, barely visible, but it was there. As the weeks turned into months, small changes began to happen. Subtle shifts that neither of them acknowledged, but both of them noticed. Emma started leaving coffee on the kitchen counter for him in the mornings. She did not ask if he wanted it, did not make a production of it. She just made it the way she liked hers, sweet and milky with a hint of vanilla, and left it there in an expensive mug before retreating to her room. It was a simple gesture, born more from habit than intention. She had always made coffee for her mother in the mornings, a small way of showing care, and the routine felt natural, even in this strange new life. The first few times, Alexander ignored it. He had his coffee delivered from a specific cafe every morning, prepared exactly to his specifications. Dark roast, black, no sugar, served at precisely 170 degrees. It arrived at 7:30 each morning like clockwork, brought by a service that catered to executives who demanded perfection. But one morning, running late for a crucial meeting, he grabbed the cup she had left without thinking. He took a sip as he headed to the elevator and paused. It was sweet, far sweeter than he usually drank his coffee. The vanilla, an unexpected addition that should have been cloying but somehow was not. There was something comforting about it, something that reminded him of mornings from his childhood before everything had fallen apart. The warmth spread through him, not just from the temperature of the liquid, but from the realization that someone had made this for him, not because they were paid to, not because it was their job, but just because. He did not say anything to her about it, did not acknowledge the gesture, but the next morning, the cup was empty when he left for work, and the morning after that, and every morning that followed. Emma also began cooking. The penthouse had a massive kitchen that looked like it had never been used, all gleaming appliances and pristine countertops, a space designed more for showing off than for actual food preparation. There was a commercial-grade stove with 8 burners, a refrigerator big enough to walk into, counters made of marble that probably cost more than a car. She started small, making simple meals for herself, comfort food that reminded her of better times. Pasta with homemade sauce, roasted vegetables that she seasoned carefully, homemade bread that filled the penthouse with the scent of yeast and warmth. But she always made extra. She would leave a plate covered with aluminum foil on the counter with a note written on a scrap of paper in her careful handwriting. Dinner, if you want it. No pressure. No expectations. Just food offered freely. An invitation without demand. The notes were brief, sometimes just a description of what she had made, sometimes a small comment about her day. She did not expect responses, and did not get them. Alexander ate in his office most nights, ordering from expensive restaurants that delivered meals in elegant packaging, food that was beautifully presented but somehow tasteless, as if the chefs cared more about appearance than substance. But one evening, exhausted from a particularly brutal day of negotiations that had stretched for 12 hours, he found himself staring at the covered plate on the counter. He lifted the foil. Pasta. Homemade sauce that smelled like garlic and herbs and tomatoes that had been cooked down slowly. A side of garlic bread that was still warm to the touch. It smelled incredible. Nothing like the sterile perfection that usually constituted his meals. He took a bite, then another, and before he knew it, the plate was empty. It was the best meal he had eaten in months. Not because of complexity or technical skill, but because it tasted like someone had actually cared about making it. There was love in that food, attention and care that transformed simple ingredients into something that felt like home. He rinsed the plate and put it in the dishwasher, a small gesture that felt significant, though he could not have explained why. The next night, he found himself in the kitchen as she cooked. He did not plan it, did not think about it, just wandered in after work and sat at the island, watching her work. She looked up, surprise evident on her face, but she did not comment on his presence. She just continued what she was doing, chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency, her knife moving in a steady rhythm against the cutting board. She stirred pots, tasted sauces, and adjusted seasonings, adding pinches of herbs with the confidence of someone who had cooked many meals. She hummed while she worked, a soft melody he did not recognize, something that made the massive kitchen feel warm and alive in a way it never had before. The scent of onions and garlic filled the air, mixing with the smell of chicken roasting in the oven. When she noticed him still watching, she smiled. "Hungry?" she asked, her voice gentle, without judgment or expectation. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, something tight in his chest that he could not name. She set a plate in front of him, and they ate in silence. It was not uncomfortable. It was just quiet, a shared space without the need for performance or pretense, without the carefully maintained distance that usually defined their interactions. When he finished, he stood to leave, then paused, his hand on the back of the chair. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She looked up, meeting his eyes fully for one of the first times since she had arrived. "You are welcome," she replied. It was such a simple exchange, barely more than pleasantries, but it felt significant, like a door had opened just a crack, letting in the first hint of light. Their public appearances became easier as time passed and they developed a rhythm. Emma no longer felt like she was acting every moment, though she still maintained the facade they had built. She had learned his habits intimately, could read his moods in the subtle shifts of his expression that others would never notice. The way he tensed his jaw when someone asked personal questions, the way his smile never reached his eyes when he was uncomfortable or impatient, the way he would drum his fingers almost imperceptibly on the table when he was calculating something, running numbers or strategies in his head. She started covering for him instinctively, redirecting conversations before they could become invasive, making jokes that eased the tension in rooms that often felt thick with unspoken competition and judgment. She had a gift for reading people, for understanding what they needed to hear, for making them feel valued and seen. At one event, she spent 20 minutes talking to a waiter about his dreams of opening a restaurant, asking detailed questions about his vision, his menu ideas, encouraging him with a warmth that seemed to light up the entire space. She treated him like he mattered, like his dreams were important, and the young man practically glowed under her attention. At another gathering, she helped an older woman who was struggling with her coat, chatting easily about the woman's grandchildren while Alexander's business partners watched. The woman, who turned out to be the wife of a major investor, later told her husband that Alexander had clearly married well, that any man who had won the heart of someone so kind and genuine must have hidden depths. The comment got back to Alexander through business channels, and he found himself oddly proud, not of himself, but of her. People began commenting on how good they were together, how natural they seemed, how Alexander had changed since meeting her. He seemed less cold, more approachable, almost human instead of the calculating machine he had been before. Business partners who had always kept him at arm's length started inviting him to more personal events, family barbecues and casual dinners, because they wanted Emma there. She made spaces feel warmer just by being in them, made conversations flow more easily, made people feel comfortable in a way that Alexander never had. Alexander started noticing the way she handled people, truly observing her interactions rather than just monitoring them for mistakes. She had a gift for making others feel seen, for asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. She remembered details about people's lives, asking follow-up questions about children's soccer games or elderly parents' health issues, showing care that was not performative but real. In his world, where every interaction was strategic and calculated, her authenticity stood out like a beacon. One night, at a charity gala held in a ballroom that dripped with chandeliers and wealth, a business rival named Thomas Morrison made a snide comment about Alexander. They were seated at a table with several other couples, picking at overpriced meals that were more about presentation than substance. Thomas, who had lost several deals to Alexander over the years, had been drinking steadily throughout the evening, his words becoming sharper with each glass of wine. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink, and said loudly enough for the entire table to hear, "You know, Alexander, I have always wondered how you sleep at night. Building your empire on the backs of companies you have crushed, people whose livelihoods you have destroyed without a second thought. Tell me, does success built on ruthlessness taste sweet Or does it leave a bitter aftertaste? The table went silent, the clinking of silverware stopping abruptly. Everyone waited to see how Alexander would respond, some faces showing discomfort, others barely concealed anticipation for the confrontation. Alexander's jaw tightened, his hand gripping his fork just a fraction too hard. But before he could formulate a response, Emma stepped in. She set down her wineglass with deliberate calm and turned to Thomas with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "It must be exhausting," she said, her voice sweet but with an edge of steel underneath. "Spending so much energy tearing others down instead of building something of your own. I have always believed that true success is measured not by what you take from others, but by what you create, by the innovation and vision you bring to the world. Alexander has built companies that employ thousands of people, that have revolutionized entire industries, that have created opportunities where none existed before." Perhaps if you focused more on your own achievements rather than obsessing over his, you would not feel so threatened by his success. After all, envy is such an unattractive quality, do you not think? The table erupted in awkward laughter and awkward coughs. Thomas's face turned red, a flush creeping up from his collar, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a response. His wife placed a hand on his arm, whispering something that made him slump back in his chair, defeated. The other guests quickly changed the subject, and the rest of the dinner passed without incident, though Alexander could feel the weight of impressed glances directed at Emma throughout the meal. On the drive home, the city lights streaming past the windows of his car, he looked at her, really looked at her. "You did not have to do that," he said, his voice quieter than usual, almost uncertain. She shrugged, looking out the window at the buildings sliding by. "He was being rude," she replied simply. "You are my husband. Even if it is pretend, I am not going to let someone disrespect you like that, treat you like you are something less than human, just because he is jealous of what you have accomplished." Alexander stared at her, something shifting in his chest. A crack spreading through the walls he had built so carefully over the years. No one had ever defended him before. People feared him, respected his power, envied his success. But no one had ever stood up for him simply because they thought it was the right thing to do. They had not done it for gain or advantage or to curry favor. Emma had done it because in that moment, she had genuinely been offended on his behalf, had felt protective of him in a way that transcended their arrangement. He wanted to say something, to express what her defense had meant to him, but the words would not come. He had spent so long not feeling, not allowing himself to be vulnerable, that he did not know how to articulate the gratitude and confusion swirling inside him. So he said nothing, and they drove the rest of the way home in silence. But it was a different kind of silence than before. It was heavy with things unsaid, charged with a tension that was not uncomfortable, but rather filled with possibility. Winter came, settling over the city like a blanket of cold and darkness, and with it, the holidays approached. Alexander had planned to ignore Christmas entirely, as he always did. It was just another day to him, another marker of time passing without meaning. He had not celebrated Christmas since he was 8 years old, since that last Christmas with his parents before the accident. His aunt and uncle had put up a tree each year, but it had been a joyless affair, an obligation rather than a celebration, and he had stopped caring about it long before he left their house. But Emma had other ideas. She spent an entire day decorating the penthouse while he was at work, throwing herself into the project with an enthusiasm he would have found baffling if he had witnessed it. She had somehow convinced the building staff to help her drag a massive tree up to the penthouse, a 12-foot evergreen that filled the main living area with the scent of pine in winter. She hung lights from every possible surface, stringing them along railings and around doorways, creating a warm glow that transformed the cold modern space into something that felt almost magical. She wrapped garland around the staircase banister, hung wreaths on doors, and set out decorations that she had purchased with her own money, wanting to add personal touches that made the space feel lived in. There were little ceramic snowmen, strings of cranberries she had made herself, ornaments that were not expensive or matching, but had character and charm. She played Christmas music while she worked, singing along off-key, her voice echoing through rooms that had been silent for so long. He came home to find her on a ladder, tangled in a string of lights, laughing at herself as she tried to untangle them without falling. The lights had somehow wrapped around her arm and the ladder simultaneously, and she was stuck in a position that was both precarious and absurd. "What are you doing?" he asked. Genuine confusion, and something else in his voice, something that might have been amusement. She looked down at him, her face flushed from effort, her hair escaping from the ponytail she had pulled it into, strands falling across her face. "Making it feel like home," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, as if transforming his cold penthouse into a Christmas wonderland was a perfectly normal thing to do. He wanted to tell her it was pointless, that it was all just for show, that this was not really their home and never would be. He wanted to explain that Christmas was just a commercial holiday, meaningless and empty, designed to make people spend money on things no one needed, but the words would not come. Instead, he found himself climbing up beside her, his hands working to untangle the lights, his fingers brushing against hers in the process. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. They worked together in companionable silence, hanging ornaments and adjusting lights until the tree stood complete, glowing with warmth and color. Emma stood back to admire their work, her hands on her hips, a satisfied smile on her face. "It is perfect," she said softly. Alexander looked at the tree, then at her, and something in his chest tightened. She was right. It was perfect, not because of the tree itself, but because of what it represented: life, warmth, the opposite of everything his penthouse had been before she arrived. She began telling him stories as they worked on the rest of the decorations, stories about Christmases from her childhood, about traditions she and her mother used to have before money became too tight, before life became about survival instead of joy. They had made cookies together every Christmas Eve, she told him, spending hours in their tiny kitchen, flour dusting every surface. They had decorated them with more frosting than any cookie needed, creating elaborate designs that were more art than food. Her mother had always let her eat as much cookie dough as she wanted, even though she warned it might make her sick. They had sung carols off-key, she continued, her voice soft with memory. Neither of them could carry a tune to save their lives, but they belted out songs anyway, laughing at how terrible they sounded. They had watched old movies, the same ones every year. Classics that her mother loved, curled up together on their worn couch under a blanket her grandmother had made. They had opened presents on Christmas morning, gifts that had been carefully saved for and wrapped with love, each one precious, not because of its monetary value, but because of the thought behind it. There was no bitterness in her voice as she spoke, just a quiet sadness that made his chest ache. She had lost so much, had given up so much to care for her mother, yet she still found ways to create beauty, to hold on to the small joys that made life bearable. Alexander realized he had never met anyone like her. Everyone in his world was always calculating, always looking for an angle, always trying to gain something. Relationships were transactions. Kindness came with strings attached. Trust was a liability. But Emma gave freely, expected nothing, and somehow made everything around her feel lighter. She had brought warmth into his cold world without asking for anything in return, without demanding he change or open up or be different than he was. She just existed beside him, creating small moments of beauty, And somehow, that was enough to begin changing him in ways he did not fully understand. That night, they sat by the tree, the lights casting soft shadows across the room, making everything feel magical and unreal. The city spread out below them through the windows, but for once, Alexander was not looking at it. His attention was focused entirely on the woman beside him and the strange new feeling spreading through his chest. Emma handed him a mug of hot chocolate, topped with marshmallows that were already melting into the rich liquid, creating swirls of white against the brown. "I know this is not real," she said softly, her eyes on the tree rather than on him, as if it was easier to say difficult things without eye contact. "I know this is just a job for me and a convenience for you. But it is Christmas, and I did not want to spend it feeling like I am just going through the motions. I wanted it to feel like something, even if it is pretend, even if tomorrow everything goes back to the way it was." Alexander took the mug, his hands wrapping around the warmth, feeling the heat seep into his fingers. The ceramic was hot enough to be almost uncomfortable, grounding him in the moment. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw past the contract, past the arrangement, past the walls he had built around himself. He saw a woman who had every reason to be bitter, to be hardened by life, to view the world with the same cynicism he had cultivated for years. She had been dealt terrible hands repeatedly, had sacrificed her own dreams to save her mother, had worked herself to exhaustion just to survive, yet she still found ways to create joy, to hold on to hope, to believe that moments mattered, even when everything else felt temporary. She had taken his cold, empty penthouse and transformed it, not with money or expensive decorations, but with care and attention, and the simple belief that spaces should feel lived in. She had taken him, a man who had convinced himself he did not need anyone, and begun to show him what he was missing without ever demanding he acknowledge it. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words inadequate for what he was feeling, for the gratitude and confusion and something else swirling inside him. She smiled, and something inside him cracked wider, the fissure spreading through the foundation he had built his life upon. They drank their hot chocolate in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with the soft glow of Christmas lights and the quiet understanding that something between them was shifting, transforming into something neither of them had anticipated when they signed that contract months ago. The new year came, and with it, a shift that neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both of them felt in every interaction. Alexander found himself seeking her out, not because he had to, not because they had a public appearance scheduled, but because he wanted to. He started asking about her day, actually listening to her answers instead of just waiting for her to finish speaking. He listened to her stories about the people she used to work with at the diner, the regulars who had become familiar faces, the old man who always ordered the same breakfast and left exact change, the young mother who came in with her toddler and looked exhausted but tried so hard to be patient. She told him about the dreams she used to have, pulling them out of the box where she had buried them, dusting them off and examining them in the light. She talked about wanting to go back to school, about a love for art that she had buried under the weight of survival. She described paintings she had wanted to create, images that lived in her mind, compositions of color and light that expressed emotions she could not put into words. She talked about sculptures she had wanted to mold, forms that captured movement and emotion in three-dimensional space, pieces that would make people stop and feel something. She shared her vision of beauty she had carried inside her that had never found expression because life had demanded she focus on more practical things, on paying bills and keeping her mother alive, and surviving each day. But the dreams had never really died, she explained. They had just gone dormant, waiting for a time when she had the luxury of pursuing them.
Now, with financial security for the first time in her life, with her mother's treatments covered and her own future no longer a constant source of panic, those dreams were beginning to wake up again. He listened, and he remembered details, things that mattered to her, small pieces of information that painted a picture of who she really was beneath the role she was playing. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when she talked about color theory, the science and emotion of how colors interacted and influenced mood, the way her hands moved as if sculpting invisible forms when she described ideas she had once had, shaping air as if it were clay. He saw talent that had been buried, potential that had been crushed under necessity, and it made him angry in a way he had not expected. He was angry at a world that forced people like Emma to choose between survival and dreams, that made art seem like a luxury rather than a necessity, that valued profit over human potential. He was angry at systems that rewarded ruthlessness and ignored compassion, that allowed people with talent to waste away in minimum-wage jobs, while others with connections but no vision rose to positions of power. He was angry at himself for having been part of those systems for so long without questioning them, for having built his empire without thinking about the people whose dreams got crushed in the process. One afternoon, she came home from a walk to find an envelope on the kitchen counter, her name written on it in handwriting she did not recognize. The envelope was thick, expensive paper, and her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up. Inside was an acceptance letter to an art program at one of the most prestigious universities in the country, a school she had looked at once years ago, back when she still allowed herself to dream, before dismissing it as impossibly out of reach. Along with the letter was a note in Alexander's precise script, each letter carefully formed. "You have talent. Do not waste it. Tuition is covered for the full program. Start whenever you are ready. There is also a studio space reserved in your name downtown, fully equipped. Use it." Emma stared at the letter, tears streaming down her face, her hands shaking as she held the paper that represented a dream she had thought was dead and buried. This was not just an acceptance letter. This was her entire future, handed to her on expensive paper, made possible by someone who barely knew her, but had somehow seen something in her worth investing in. He had done this. He had taken the time to research programs, to pull whatever strings were necessary, to make something happen that she had believed was impossible. The studio space alone would have cost a fortune. She knew because she had looked once, years ago, pricing out spaces where she could work, where she could spread out and create without worrying about disturbing neighbors or lacking proper ventilation. They had all been far beyond her means, requiring deposits and monthly fees that were more than her rent. And he had just given her one, casually, as if it were nothing. She found him in his office, surrounded by papers and multiple computer screens displaying charts and figures, working as he always was. He looked up when she entered, his expression neutral, professional, but she could see something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty, as if he was not sure how she would react. "Why?" she asked, her voice shaking with emotion, unable to form a more complete question. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him weighing his words, deciding how much truth to reveal. "Because you deserve it," he said finally, as if it were obvious, as if everyone went around making dreams come true for people they had hired to play a role. "Because talent should not be wasted, because you have given up too much already. And someone should give something back to you." She crossed the room without thinking, without planning, and hugged him, catching him completely off guard. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing, unsure what to do. His arms hung uselessly at his sides. He could not remember the last time someone had hugged him like this, with pure gratitude and affection, without wanting something in return. Physical contact in his world was strategic, calculated, a handshake to seal a deal, a pat on the back to show approval, a kiss on the cheek at social events that meant nothing. But this was different. This was gratitude, affection, connection, all the things he had spent years avoiding. Slowly, hesitantly, his arms came up, wrapping around her, holding her in a way that felt both foreign and necessary. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucking under his chin, her warmth seeping into him.
He could smell her shampoo, something floral and clean, and feel the slight tremor in her body as she cried quiet tears of relief and joy against his shoulder. It was the first time they had touched outside of their public performances, and it felt different. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red but shining, and she smiled at him with such genuine happiness that he felt something shift irrevocably inside him. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and she left his office, leaving him standing there, wondering what exactly had just happened and why his chest felt so tight. Spring arrived, and the penthouse that had once felt like a cold, empty space now felt alive in ways Alexander had not thought possible. Emma had brought plants, filling corners with green life that needed tending and care. There were ferns in the bathroom, succulents on windowsills, a fiddle-leaf fig in the corner of the living room that she watered religiously and talked to when she thought no one was listening. She had brought books from second-hand stores, stacking them on tables and shelves, their worn covers a stark contrast to the pristine art books that had been there before. These were books that had been read, loved, passed from hand to hand, their pages dog-eared and their spines cracked. She had brought music, playing records on the expensive sound system that had sat unused, filling the space with jazz and blues and folk songs that made the rooms feel warm. She played Nina Simone while she cooked, Billie Holiday while she painted in the corner she had claimed as her workspace, Etta James while she cleaned, even though they had a service that came twice a week. The music made the space feel occupied, lived in, loved. Alexander found himself smiling more, genuinely smiling, in a way that reached his eyes and transformed his face. He laughed at her jokes, surprised by her quick wit and the way she could find humor in small things. He looked forward to coming home in a way he never had before. Work, which had once been his entire existence, became something he was eager to finish so he could return to the penthouse, to her presence, to the warmth she had created. His business partners noticed the change immediately. He seemed lighter, more approachable, less like a calculating machine, and more like a man who actually enjoyed living. In meetings, he was less aggressive, more willing to find solutions that benefited everyone, rather than just maximizing his own profit. He smiled at assistants, remembered their names, asked about their families. Deals that had once been difficult suddenly fell into place because people wanted to work with him, wanted to be around the version of him that Emma had somehow brought out. But with the warmth came fear, a creeping anxiety that grew stronger as the months passed. Alexander realized he was breaking his own rules, violating every principle he had established for himself years ago. He was getting attached. He cared about her, not as an employee, not as a convenience, but as someone who had become essential to his life. She was not just part of his routine. She was the reason he had a routine worth keeping. He tried to pull back, to recreate the distance that had once defined their arrangement. He worked later hours, spent more time in his office with the door closed, responded to her attempts at conversation with shorter answers. But it was too late. She had become part of his world in a way he could not undo. She was in the coffee he drank every morning, still too sweet, but perfect. She was in the meals he looked forward to, the conversations that made him think about things beyond profit and loss, the laughter that echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. She was in everything, and the thought of losing her terrified him more than any business risk he had ever taken. Emma felt it too.
the shift in her own heart that she had not anticipated and did not know how to handle. She had signed the contract thinking it would be easy, that she could play a role and walk away when the year was over, that she could keep her heart separate from the performance. She had convinced herself this was just a job, an unusual one perhaps, but still just a job. She would do what was required, take the money, and move on with her life. But somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred until they were invisible. She cared about him, deeply and genuinely. She saw past the cold exterior he presented to the world, past the walls he had built so high and thick, past the reputation that preceded him. She saw the loneliness he tried to hide, evident in the way he sat by himself in his office late at night, working on things that did not need to be worked on because he did not know what else to do with himself. She saw the vulnerability he would never admit to, the fear of connection that kept him isolated even in rooms full of people. She saw the man who had been hurt so badly as a child that he had decided it was safer to feel nothing at all, to build walls so high that nothing could reach him. And she realized, with a mix of terror and certainty that made her breath catch, that she had fallen in love with him, not with his money, not with the luxurious life he could provide, not with the status of being Mrs. Alexander Harrington. She loved the man who listened when she talked about her dreams and remembered every detail, the man who had given her back her future without asking for anything in return, the man who was learning to smile without it being a performance. She loved the way he concentrated when he worked, his brow furrowing slightly, his fingers moving across keyboards with practiced precision. She loved the way he was beginning to relax in her presence, his shoulders losing some of their constant tension when they sat together in the evenings. She loved the way he had started to let her see glimpses of who he really was beneath the armor. Small moments of vulnerability that he probably did not even realize he was showing. She loved him, and it terrified her, because she knew what was coming. The year was coming to an end. The contract would expire in 1 month, and neither of them spoke about it. The date hung over them like a storm cloud, visible but unacknowledged. They continued their routines, attending events where they played their roles perfectly, so perfectly that no one suspected anything was wrong. They shared meals that had become the highlight of both of their days, conversations that ranged from trivial to profound. They existed in a space that felt too fragile to name, too precious to examine too closely, as if speaking about it might make it shatter like glass. But the unspoken truth hung between them constantly, a question neither wanted to ask because they were afraid of the answer. What happens when the year ends? What happens to us? Are we an us? Or are we just two people fulfilling a contract? The questions circled endlessly in both of their minds, but neither had the courage to voice them. One evening, 2 weeks before the contract was set to expire, Alexander's assistant, Margaret, delivered the final payment notification. $1 million. Transferred into Emma's account as agreed, as specified in the contract they had both signed almost a year ago. Emma stared at the notification on her phone, the number that had once seemed like salvation, like the answer to every problem she had ever faced, now feeling and meaningless. She had the money. She could leave. She could start over, build the life she had always dreamed of. Her mother's medical bills were completely paid, with enough left over to cover any future treatments. There were no more debts hanging over her head like swords waiting to fall. No more creditors calling. No more panic every time the phone rang. No more choosing between food and medicine, between rent and electricity. She could go back to school full-time, pursue her art, create the future she had thought was impossible. But the thought of walking away felt like tearing herself in half, like losing a vital organ, like dying slowly. The thought of leaving this penthouse, this man, this life they had built together,
felt like losing something essential to her survival. She sat in her room, surrounded by the luxury she had grown accustomed to, the beautiful clothes and the expensive furniture, and the view of the city spread out below, and realized that none of it mattered. The expensive clothes hanging in her closet, the beautiful space she occupied, the financial security that had seemed so important, none of it meant anything if she had to leave him behind. None of it was worth the price of walking away from what they had built, from the connection that had grown between them despite their best efforts to prevent it. She had come here for money, for survival, for her mother, but she was staying, or wanting to stay, for entirely different reasons. She was staying because somewhere in this year of pretending, she had found something real. That night, Alexander found her on the balcony, staring out at the city, the lights spreading below them like fallen stars, like a universe of possibilities, and none of them feeling right. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of spring flowers from the gardens below. "The contract ends in 2 weeks," he said, his voice carefully neutral, controlled in a way that betrayed how much this conversation cost, how much effort it took to keep his voice steady. She nodded, not looking at him, afraid that if she met his eyes she would fall apart completely, that all the feelings she had been holding back would spill out in a torrent she could not control. "I know," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sounds of the city below. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not touching, maintaining that last barrier between them. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they had not said, everything they had been avoiding for. "What will you do?" he asked finally, the question simple, but weighted with so much meaning, with all the hope and fear he could not express directly. She finally looked at him, her eyes searching his face, looking for something she was afraid she would not find, looking for confirmation that she was not alone in feeling this way. "I do not know," she said honestly, her voice breaking slightly. "What do you want me to do?" It was the question he had been avoiding, the one that terrified him more than any business deal, any risk he had ever taken, any loss he had ever faced. He had built empires, negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced down competitors who wanted to destroy him. But this simple question from this woman left him feeling more vulnerable than he had ever felt in his life. He had spent his entire existence in control, building walls to keep people out, to keep himself safe from the pain he had experienced as a child, when everything had been ripped away in one terrible night. But she had walked through those walls without even trying, without force or strategy or manipulation, just by being herself, by being kind and warm and genuine in a world where those qualities were rare. She had found her way past every defense he had built, and now he was faced with the most important choice of his life: let her go and return to the emptiness he had known, the cold existence that had been his life before she arrived, the success without meaning, the wealth without purpose. Or take a risk on something he had never believed in, something he had convinced himself did not exist, something that terrified him precisely because it mattered so much. "I want you to stay," he said, and the words came out rough, unpolished, stripped of the careful control he usually maintained. His voice cracked slightly, revealing the emotion beneath. "Not because of the contract, not because of appearances or business or any of the reasons we started this. I want you to stay because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You walked into my empty home and you filled it with warmth and life and something I did not even know I was missing until you showed it to me." He turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his, holding on like she was the only solid thing in a world that had started spinning. "You taught me what it means to care about someone,
to want their happiness more than your own comfort, to look forward to moments instead of just enduring time. You taught me that life is not about accumulating wealth or building empires or maintaining control. It is about connection, about choosing to be vulnerable, about letting someone matter enough that they can hurt you. Emma's breath caught, tears streaming down her face as she listened to him speak, hearing the vulnerability in his voice, the fear and hope mixing together in a way that made her chest ache. He stepped closer, one hand releasing hers to cup her face, his thumb wiping away tears that kept falling. "You taught me something I did not think was real," he continued, his voice soft now, intimate. "You showed me that life is not about power or control or protecting yourself from pain. It is about moments that take your breath away. It is about someone making coffee too sweet because they know you need something warm to start your day. It is about laughter that fills empty rooms and makes them feel like home for the first time. It is about love that does not come with conditions or contracts or expectations. It is about choosing to be with someone, not because you have to, not because it makes sense or because it is practical, but because the alternative, a life without them, is unthinkable." "I thought this was just a job," she whispered, her voice breaking completely, all her own walls crumbling. "I thought I could walk away. I thought I could take the money and build a new life and never look back. That I could file this away as a strange year that helped me survive. But I fell in love with you, and I do not know how to leave. I do not know how to walk away from the person who saw me when I had spent so long being invisible, who believed in my dreams when I had stopped believing in them myself, who taught me that it is possible to be valued for who you are, not just for what you can provide." He pulled her into his arms then, holding her like she was the only thing that mattered in a world that had always felt too big and too empty and too cold. "Then, do not," he said, his voice rough with all the emotion he had suppressed for so many years. "Stay, not as my employee, not as part of an arrangement. Stay as my wife, for real this time. Stay because you want to, because you choose to, because what we have built together is too important to let go. I do not care about appearances or business deals or what anyone else thinks. I care about you. I love you. And I do not want to spend another day pretending that this is not real, pretending that you have not become the most important person in my world." She looked up at him through her tears, and in his eyes, she saw everything she had hoped for, everything she had been afraid to believe in. Not the millionaire with his empire and his reputation and his power, not the cold businessman who calculated every move and trusted no one, but the man who had learned to love because she had shown him how, who had let down his walls and let her in, who had chosen vulnerability over control, connection over isolation, love over fear. "Yes," she whispered, her hands coming up to frame his face, feeling the slight stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "Yes, I will stay, not because of money or security or any of the practical reasons I came here. I will stay because I love you, because you are the home I did not know I was looking for, because leaving you would be like leaving part of myself behind, and I am not sure I would survive it." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the polite, performative kisses they had shared at public events, the brief touches of lips that meant nothing and fooled everyone. This was real, urgent, desperate, filled with months of restrained emotion finally breaking free like a dam bursting. It was a promise of forever, a beginning of something new, a leap into something unknown and terrifying and absolutely right. "Yes," she whispered, her hands coming up to frame his face, feeling the slight stubble on his jaw, the warmth of his skin. "Yes, I will stay, not because of money or security or any of the practical reasons I came here. I will stay because I love you, because you are the home I did not know I was looking for, because leaving you would be like leaving part of myself behind, and I am not sure I would survive it." He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the polite, performative kisses they had shared at public events, the brief touches of lips that meant nothing and fooled everyone. This was real, urgent, desperate, filled with months of restrained emotion, finally breaking free like a dam bursting. It was a promise of forever, a beginning of something new, a leap into something unknown and terrifying, and absolutely right. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her closer, and she melted into him, feeling like she had finally come home after a lifetime of wandering. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me again," he said, "for real this time. No contract, no arrangement, no end date. Just us, choosing each other every single day." "Yes," she said again, laughing through her tears. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The world expected them to part ways when the contract ended. Business partners had already begun speculating about who Alexander would date next, whether he would go back to his solitary lifestyle. Tabloids had stories ready to publish about their inevitable split, with headlines already written and sources quoted predicting that it had been convenient while it lasted, but was always destined to end. People had placed bets on how quickly the marriage would dissolve once the year was up, with odds favoring separation within weeks. But when the contract officially expired, when that date on the calendar finally arrived, Alexander and Emma did something no one expected. They stood together in front of their closest friends and family, not because a contract bound them, but because they chose each other freely and completely. They remarried in a small ceremony with no cameras, no press, no performance or pretense. Just two people promising to build a life together based on love rather than convenience, on choice rather than obligation. Emma's mother attended, healthy and strong thanks to the treatments that had saved her life, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her daughter marry for love. She had known, somehow, even before Emma had admitted it to herself. She had seen the way Emma talked about Alexander, the way her entire face changed when she mentioned something he had said or done. She had seen her daughter fall in love, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever witnessed. A handful of close friends witnessed the simple exchange of vows that meant everything precisely because they were real. Margaret was there, smiling with satisfaction at the outcome she had secretly hoped for from the beginning. A few colleagues who had become genuine friends over the year. Emma's former coworker from the diner, who cried happy tears and kept saying she always knew Emma deserved something wonderful. The ceremony was held at sunset on the penthouse balcony, with the city spread out below them as witness.
Emma wore a simple white dress that she had chosen herself, elegant and understated, nothing like the elaborate gown a society wedding would have demanded. Alexander wore a suit, but no tie, looking more relaxed than anyone had ever seen him. They wrote their own vows, speaking from the heart, rather than reciting traditional words. "I promise to keep making your coffee too sweet," Emma said, her voice shaking with emotion but strong with conviction, "even when you insist you prefer it black. I promise to fill our home with warmth and life and terrible singing. I promise to see you, the real you, every single day, and to love that person with everything I have. I promise to let you in," Alexander said, his own voice thick with emotion that he no longer tried to hide. "To tear down the walls I built and to never build them again. I promise to value moments over money, connection over control, love over everything else. I promise to wake up every morning grateful that you chose to stay." There was not a dry eye on the balcony when they kissed, sealing promises that were witnessed by the people who mattered most. Emma continued her art, throwing herself into her studies with a passion that had been dormant for years, but now burned brightly. She attended classes at the university, sitting in studio surrounded by other artists, finally able to explore techniques and theories she had only read about before. Her professors recognized her raw talent immediately, the way she saw color and composition, the emotion she could convey through simple brushstrokes. She spent hours in the studio space Alexander had secured for her, a converted warehouse space with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the room with natural light. She painted during the day, creating pieces that spoke of transformation and hope, of darkness giving way to light, of survival and beauty found in unexpected places. Her work was deeply personal, each piece telling a story of her journey from desperation to hope, from loneliness to love. She painted the diner where she had worked, but bathed in golden light that made it look almost sacred. She painted her mother's hospital room, transformed into a garden of flowers. She painted the penthouse at Christmas, capturing the warmth she had created in that cold space. Her first gallery showing came 8 months after she started school. A small gallery in the Arts District had seen her work during a student exhibition and immediately offered her a solo show. Alexander helped her prepare, but he let her make all the decisions, understanding that this was her dream, her accomplishment, something she needed to own completely. The opening night was packed with people, art collectors and critics, and ordinary people who had seen the announcement and been curious. Emma stood nervously by her paintings, wearing a simple black dress, watching as strangers examined her work. Alexander stayed close, but not hovering, letting her have the spotlight, his pride evident in every glance he directed at her. One of the city's most respected art critics spent nearly 20 minutes in front of a painting Emma had titled "Coming Home," a piece that showed a woman standing in a doorway, light streaming around her, her face transformed by joy and relief. The critic approached Emma at the end of the night. "This is extraordinary work," she said, gesturing to the paintings surrounding them. "You have a gift for capturing emotional truth, for making viewers feel what you felt when you created these. I see a major career ahead of you if you want it." Emma thanked her, barely able to process the words, her hands shaking with a mixture of nerves and excitement. By the end of the evening, red dots marked nearly every painting as sold. Gallery owners approached her with offers for future shows. A museum curator expressed interest in acquiring one of her pieces for their permanent collection. Emma felt like she was floating, like she might wake up at any moment and find herself back in her tiny apartment, back at the diner, back in the life where dreams were luxuries she could not afford. Alexander watched her throughout the night, his heart so full it physically ached. This was what love looked like, he realized. Not possession or control, but witnessing someone you cared about achieving their dreams and feeling genuine joy at their success. He had spent years accumulating wealth and power, but none of it had ever felt as satisfying as watching Emma stand in front of her paintings, accepting congratulations and praise she had earned through talent and hard work. Her art career grew steadily over the following years. Her work was eventually displayed in galleries across the city, then across the country. Critics praised her unique vision, the way she captured hope without sentimentality, pain without melodrama, love without cliches. Each piece told a story that resonated with viewers, making them stop and feel something real in a world that often felt numb and disconnected. She never forgot where she came from, often incorporating elements of her past into her work, transforming the mundane into something beautiful, finding dignity in the struggles of ordinary people. Alexander shifted his focus as well, using his wealth not just to build empires, but to create opportunities for people like Emma, people who had talent and dreams but lacked resources. He started scholarship programs for students from low-income backgrounds, funding their education completely so they would never have to choose between pursuing their dreams and survival. He invested in community art programs, creating spaces where children from struggling neighborhoods could explore creativity without cost. He funded programs that provided support for families dealing with medical crises, remembering Emma's mother and the impossible choices they had faced. He worked with hospitals to establish funds that covered treatments insurance companies denied, ensuring that people would not have to choose between life-saving care and financial ruin. He hired people from disadvantaged backgrounds for positions in his companies, creating pathways to success for those who had been overlooked by society. His business partners noticed the change in his approach. He was less focused on maximizing profit at all costs and more interested in creating value that extended beyond shareholders. Some criticized him for going soft, for allowing emotion to cloud his business judgment, but the results spoke for themselves. His companies remained profitable while also making genuine positive impacts on communities. Employee satisfaction increased dramatically, leading to better retention and productivity. His reputation shifted from ruthless businessman to visionary leader who understood that true success meant lifting others up rather than stepping on them to climb higher. Their penthouse, once cold and empty, became a home filled with laughter, warmth, and love. The transformation was complete and profound. The sterile showroom had become a living space that reflected the people who inhabited it. Emma's paintings covered walls that had once displayed expensive but impersonal art. Plants thrived in every room, creating pockets of green life. Books were scattered on tables, some open and face down where someone had paused mid-reading. Music played throughout the day, different genres depending on the mood and activity. Friends visited regularly, something that would have been unthinkable in Alexander's previous life. Emma had maintained friendships from her old life, people who kept her grounded and reminded her where she came from. Her former coworker from the diner came by often, bringing her children, who called Emma aunt and ran through the penthouse with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. Alexander found himself enjoying these visits, playing with the children, listening to their stories, experiencing a kind of warmth he had never known in his own childhood. They hosted dinners where conversation mattered more than status, where people came not to network but to connect. Artists and business people, teachers and entrepreneurs, wealthy patrons and struggling students all sat around their table, brought together by Emma's gift for seeing the humanity in everyone. Alexander learns to cook, something he had never bothered with before, finding unexpected pleasure in preparing meals alongside Emma, working together to create something that would bring people joy. Emma's mother moved into one of the guest rooms, a decision they made together and both felt right about. She had beaten the cancer, emerging from treatment weak but determined to make the most of her second chance at life. Having her close felt natural, healing old wounds for Emma, who had spent so long terrified of losing her. Margaret had worried initially about how this would affect the household dynamic, but it only made things better. Emma's mother brought her own warmth and wisdom, treating Alexander like the son she had never had, offering him the kind of unconditional maternal love he had not experienced since he was 8 years old. She baked cookies that filled the penthouse with scents of vanilla and cinnamon, recreating the recipes from Emma's childhood. She gardened on the balcony, creating a small paradise of herbs and flowers that attracted butterflies and birds. She told stories about Emma's childhood that made Alexander laugh and understand even better the woman he had married. She never asked for anything, never took their generosity for granted, but her presence filled a void none of them had fully acknowledged until she arrived. And every single morning, without fail, Emma still made coffee too sweet, adding extra sugar and vanilla and cream until it was more dessert than beverage. And every morning, Alexander drank it with a genuine smile, no longer because he had learned to tolerate it,
but because he genuinely loved it. The sweetness had become familiar, comforting, a reminder of how far they had both come. Sometimes he would catch her watching him take that first sip, a small smile playing on her lips, and he would reach for her hand, their fingers intertwining naturally, a gesture that had become second nature. They developed rituals that marked their days and gave their life together shape and meaning. Morning coffee together before the day began, sitting at the kitchen island and talking about their plans, or just enjoying the quiet. Cooking dinner together most evenings, moving around the kitchen in a coordinated dance they had perfected. Her chopping vegetables while he prepared sauces, both of them stealing tastes and offering bites, working together to create meals that nourished more than just bodies. Sunday mornings became sacred time, dedicated to sleeping late and staying in bed, talking about everything and nothing, making love slowly and with intention, reminding themselves that they had chosen this, chosen each other, chosen to build this life together. They read the newspaper together, sharing interesting articles, debating ideas, learning to navigate disagreements without them threatening their foundation. They traveled together, not to the business conferences that had once dominated Alexander's schedule, but to places Emma had always wanted to see. They spent 2 weeks in Paris, wandering through museums where Emma studied masterpieces for hours, while Alexander watched her more than the art, fascinated by her passion and insight. They visited small villages in Italy where they cooked with local families and learned traditional techniques. They explored markets in Morocco, overwhelmed by colors and scents and the vibrant life of the Medina. They hiked through rainforests in Costa Rica, swam in waterfalls, and fell asleep to the sounds of the jungle. These trips changed Alexander fundamentally. He learned to be present rather than always thinking about the next deal, the next acquisition, the next goal to achieve. He learned to appreciate beauty for its own sake, not as an investment or a status symbol. He learned that some of the best moments in life came from unexpected conversations with strangers, from getting lost and finding hidden treasures, from letting go of control and allowing experiences to unfold naturally. On their 3rd anniversary of their real wedding, not the contracted one, but the day they had chosen each other freely, Alexander surprised Emma with a renewal of vows. He had arranged everything secretly with the help of her mother and Margaret, planning an intimate ceremony at a small vineyard outside the city. Emma cried when she realized what was happening, overwhelmed by the gesture and what it represented. "I wanted to do this," Alexander explained as they stood together surrounded by grapevines heavy with fruit, "because 3 years ago I made you promises, and I want you to know I have kept them. I tore down my walls and I have never rebuilt them. I choose connection over control every single day. I wake up grateful that you stayed, but I also wanted to make new promises, because we have both changed and grown. And I want to promise the person you are now that I will love the person you continue to become." They exchanged new vows, speaking about the life they had built and the future they envisioned. Emma promised to always push him to grow, to never let him retreat into his old patterns, to challenge him when he needed challenging and support him when he needed support. Alexander promised to continue opening his heart, to be vulnerable even when it scared him, to trust in their love even when his old fears tried to resurface. As the years passed, their love deepened in ways neither had anticipated. They learned each other's patterns and preferences so thoroughly that they could anticipate needs before they were spoken. Alexander knew when Emma needed space to create and when she needed company. Emma knew when Alexander was stressed and needed to talk, and when he needed to work through things quietly. They developed a shorthand of looks and touches that communicated volumes without words. They also learned to navigate challenges together. There were difficult times when Alexander's old habits surfaced, when stress made him retreat emotionally, when he tried to control situations rather than trusting the process.
Emma learned how to call him on this without attacking him, how to gently remind him that he did not have to face everything alone anymore. There were times when Emma doubted her talent, when rejection from a gallery or a harsh review made her question everything. Alexander learned how to support her without trying to fix everything, how to listen and validate rather than immediately jumping into problem-solving mode. They faced external challenges too, business deals that went bad, threatening their financial security in ways that brought up old fears for both of them. Family drama when extended relatives emerged from Alexander's past, trying to reconnect now that he was no longer alone, motivated more by his wealth than genuine affection. Health scares that reminded them how fragile life was and how precious their time together. But they faced everything together, their bond growing stronger with each challenge they navigated successfully. 5 years into their marriage, Emma became pregnant. The news surprised them both, as they had not been actively trying, but had not been preventing it either, letting nature take its course. Alexander's reaction surprised Emma and himself. He had never imagined wanting children, had never thought himself capable of being a good father given his own childhood trauma. But when Emma showed him the positive test, his eyes filled with tears, and he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "I am terrified," he admitted that night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "What if I do not know how to do this? What if I am like my aunt and uncle, cold and distant? What if I damage our child the way I was damaged?" Emma took his face in her hands, making him look at her. "You are nothing like them," she said firmly. "You have spent years learning how to love, how to be vulnerable, how to connect. You will be an amazing father because you know what it feels like to not have that, and you will never let our child feel that way." Their daughter was born on a spring morning, entering the world with a loud cry that announced her presence unmistakably. They named her Hope, because that was what Emma had brought into Alexander's life, and what their love represented to both of them. Holding his daughter for the first time, Alexander felt something inside him heal. A wound he had carried since childhood finally closing. This tiny person represented possibility, represented a future built on love rather than fear, represented everything good he and Emma had created together. Fatherhood transformed Alexander in unexpected ways. He reduced his work hours dramatically, wanting to be present for every milestone, every moment. He changed diapers and walked the floors at 3 in the morning when Hope had colic, singing off-key lullabies that somehow soothed her. He read stories with different voices for each character, making Emma laugh from the doorway as she watched them together. He built blanket forts and had tea parties, and learned to braid hair through many failed attempts. Emma watched him become the father she had known he could be, and fell in love with him all over again. The man who had hired her to pretend to be his wife, who had been so cold and controlled and afraid of feeling anything, was now lying on the floor making silly faces to make his daughter giggle. The transformation was complete and beautiful, and everything she had hoped for when she first saw past his walls to the man underneath. Hope grew up in a home filled with love and creativity and warmth. She showed artistic talent early, and Emma nurtured it, while also making sure she had a well-rounded childhood. Alexander taught her about business and strategy, but also about compassion and using resources to help others. Together, they raised a child who was confident but kind, talented but humble, privileged but aware of how fortunate she was. Emma's mother lived to see her granddaughter's 10th birthday, a milestone she had once believed she would never reach. She passed peacefully in her sleep, having spent her final years surrounded by love and comfort, able to watch her daughter thrive and her granddaughter grow. Her funeral was well attended, filled with people whose lives she had touched with her quiet kindness and wisdom. Alexander delivered a eulogy that had everyone in tears, talking about how this woman had welcomed him into her family, had shown him what maternal love looked like, had helped him heal wounds he had carried for decades. The loss hit them all hard, but they grieved together, supporting each other through the pain. Hope asked questions about death and heaven and where her grandmother had gone, and Emma answered honestly, sharing her belief that love never truly dies, that the people we lose stay with us in memories and lessons and the ways they shaped who we become. They planted a garden in her mother's memory on the balcony, tending the flowers together, keeping her spirit alive through growing things. As Hope entered her teenage years, Alexander and Emma faced new challenges. The normal struggles of parenting an adolescent were complicated by their wealth and status. Hope attended an exclusive private school where some children were spoiled and entitled, and they worked hard to keep her grounded. They required her to volunteer in the community, to understand that privilege came with responsibility. They talked openly about money and class and the unfairness of systems that allowed some people to thrive while others struggled through no fault of their own. They also told her their story, the truth about how they met and how their relationship evolved. Hope was 13 when they sat her down and explained that their marriage had started as a business arrangement, that her mother had been hired to play a role, that their love had been unexpected and unplanned, but real. Hope processed this information thoughtfully, asking questions and thinking deeply about what it meant. "So you fell in love, even though you were trying not to," she said finally. "That is actually really romantic. Like you could not help it, even though you had all these walls up." Emma and Alexander looked at each other and laughed, realizing their daughter was right. It was romantic, in its own unconventional way. The fact that they had found each other despite every obstacle, despite their own resistance, despite starting from a place of pure transaction, made their love story unique and powerful. Alexander continued to evolve as a person throughout these years. Therapy helped him work through childhood trauma he had buried for decades, teaching him healthier ways to process emotions and handle stress. He became involved in mentorship programs, working with young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds, offering not just financial support, but genuine guidance and care. He found meaning in helping others avoid the mistakes he had made, in showing young people that success did not require becoming cold and isolated. Emma's art continued to evolve as well, her work becoming more widely recognized and celebrated. A major museum mounted a retrospective of her career when she was only 42, an unusual honor for someone so relatively young. The exhibition traced her artistic journey from her earliest student work through her most recent pieces, showing how her style had matured and deepened while maintaining the emotional honesty that made her work so compelling. Alexander attended the opening with Hope, both of them dressed up and proud, watching as Emma gave a speech about her journey that had the audience mesmerized. In her speech, Emma talked about the importance of taking chances, of saying yes to opportunities even when they scared you, of being willing to transform and grow. She talked about her own journey from poverty and desperation to the life she now led, not to boast, but to encourage others who felt trapped by circumstances. She talked about the importance of art in processing emotion and making sense of the world, about how creating beauty from pain was one of the most human things we could do. And she talked about love, about how it had saved her in ways that went far beyond financial security. "Real love transforms you," she said, looking directly at Alexander in the audience. "It challenges you to become better than you thought you could be. It asks you to be vulnerable when every instinct tells you to protect yourself. It requires you to see another person fully and choose them anyway, flaws and fears and all. I am grateful every day for the love I found in the most unexpected place, for the man who taught me that transformation is always possible if you are willing to do the work." There was not a dry eye in the audience when she finished. Alexander met her afterward, pulling her into a kiss that was captured by photographers and appeared in art magazines and social media, an image of love that resonated with people far beyond the art world. On their 20th anniversary of the day they first met,
The day Emma had walked into his penthouse with a small suitcase and a heart full of fear and hope, they returned to that moment in conversation. They were older now, Alexander's hair showing more gray, Emma's face carrying the character of years well lived. Hope was away at college, studying art history and business, preparing to bridge both of her parents' worlds. "Do you ever regret it?" Alexander asked as they sat together on the balcony where they had shared so many important conversations. Signing that contract, walking into this strange arrangement. Emma thought about it seriously, considering the question with the depth it deserved. "I regret that I had to make that choice," she said finally. "I regret living in a world where desperation can force people into situations like that. But I do not regret what came from it." "I do not regret finding you, finding us, finding this life. I regret offering the contract," Alexander said quietly. "I regret thinking I could buy what I needed, that I could fake connection without it becoming real. I regret being so broken that I thought that was a reasonable solution to my loneliness. But like you, I do not regret what came from it. You taught me how to live, really live, not just exist. You taught me that love is not a weakness, but the greatest strength we have. You taught me that opening your heart is terrifying, but worth it, always worth it." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching the city lights below, the same city that had witnessed their journey from strangers bound by contract to partners bound by choice, the same penthouse that had transformed from tomb to home, the same life that had evolved from empty to full. Emma had taught Alexander the true value of love, and in doing so, had given him something no amount of money could buy: purpose, meaning, connection, joy, family, a reason to wake up in the morning that went beyond profit margins and business deals. She had shown him that being vulnerable was not weakness, but courage, that needing someone was not dependence, but interdependence, that love multiplied rather than divided when shared freely. And Alexander had given Emma more than financial security. He had believed in her when she had stopped believing in herself. He had given her back her dreams and supported her as she pursued them. He had loved her not despite her past, but including her past, seeing her fully and choosing her completely. He had shown her that she deserved good things, that her worth was not tied to her productivity or usefulness, that she could be loved simply for being herself. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone: a partnership rooted in mutual respect and genuine affection, a home filled with warmth and creativity and love, a family that chose each other every day, a life that mattered not because of wealth or status, but because of connection and meaning and the small moments that add up to a lifetime of joy. The millionaire who had paid a poor woman to be his wife for a year had gotten far more than he bargained for. He had expected an employee who would play a role. Instead, he had found a partner who had transformed his entire existence. The contract had expired 20 years ago, but their commitment to each other only grew stronger with time. They had learned that love cannot be bought or manufactured or controlled, but when it is real, when it is chosen freely, when it is nurtured with care and intention, it becomes the most valuable thing a person can. As the sun set over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Alexander pulled Emma close and whispered words he never tired of saying: "I love you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for teaching me what matters. Thank you for making my life worth living." Emma smiled, resting her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "I love you too," whispered back. "Thank you for being brave enough to let me in. Thank you for choosing me every day. Thank you for the life." And in that moment, with the city spread out below them and the future stretching ahead, they both knew with absolute certainty that they had found something rare and precious: true love, earned through choice and effort and the willingness to transform. A love that had started as a transaction but had become transcendent.
A love that proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places, and that being open to transformation can lead to miracles. The contract had brought them together, but love had made them stay, and that all the difference.